Well, good morning, church. Again, welcome to Genesis. One of the things that makes our community unique, and one of the expressions that we have, goes like this: our heroes are among us, everyday people who live like Jesus. What that means is that you are the heroes of our community as we say yes to the invitations of God, as we continue to pursue our unique invitations of our lives being open to God. And so we celebrate the people here. And so this morning, we have Ed Gregosian, and Ed is going to be teaching this morning. Ed is a community member here at Genesis. He leads up the Brotherhood breakfast on the first Saturday of the month. He has a Thursday night group at his house on testimony time. It's very rare for Ed not to raise his hand and to tell us about how he experienced God in his week. Ed is incredibly vulnerable, and he tells us a lot of things about his life, and he shares it with this community. I know of Ed is incredibly generous, and he lives open-handedly. And Ed has also said, "Bo, I want to open my mouth and share. I'm willing. Let me." Can I, And we're like, yeah, Ed, And so Ed has stepped up today, and he's going to be teaching us about the practice of justice for today. Now, Ed's probably tell the story. He was a lawyer for many, many years and has some really ideas about justice, but the Lord is continuing to teach him. Ed is an ongoing learner, too, a lifelong learner. And so even though he's retired, he's continuing to grow and to learn. And so we're honored that Ed would be like, yes, all right, let's do this today. And so Ed has said yes to this invitation. He's one of our heroes, and we're grateful that he's willing to open your mouth. Be warned, if you tell me you're willing, we will give you the opportunity. It was not only willing, but you sense Jesus inviting you. And so we love this as a community. Our heroes are among us. And so, Ed, you're one of our heroes. We're grateful that you'd be willing to open your mouth this morning and to encourage us and to share us with what you're learning. And so, Father, may our hearts, may our ears, may our eyes be opened to receive of you. Open our eyes to the beauty of your instruction. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed.
Good morning. So the last time I did this, I went way over, so I'm going to turn on the timer on right now. So today I'm going to be talking about justice, and more specifically, doing justice as a spiritual discipline. So what does this mean? In this world, we all know there's injustice, oppression, and inequality that harms millions of people. Racism, poverty, gay bashing, sexism, homelessness, healthcare and food insecurity. All this injustice and oppression creates separation and anxiety and isolation. So in response, God calls us to do justice. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means to act justly with sincerity and from your heart. It means to build and restore relationships and reconcile. It means to act from compassion and use your voice to support, to challenge, and to comfort. It means to bless the vulnerable and to help the least of our Lord's brothers. And finally, and you'll learn why, it means behold your mother. So, my personal experience, and this will take a few minutes. Growing up, I grew up in Royal Oak, and as a child, I would go and visit my grandmother who lived south of Palmer Park. And this was probably when I was young enough to swing and old enough to swing on a swing set. We walked over to Palmer Park, walked into the playground, and I asked my grandmother if I could swing on the swings. And she said, oh no. She said, they, using a racial epithet to describe black children, they've been on those swings. And if you get on those swings, you're going to get dirty. And I thought, what does that mean? How is that even possible? Later, as a teenager, probably just before I went into high school, the civil rights movements in Alabama and Georgia were really starting to build up. And I remember we had a little TV that was always by the dinner table when we were eating dinner. I remember seeing a report on a protest march in Alabama. It might have been the Children's March. And the police were using fire hoses to blow and roll down the sidewalk the protesters. And I believe there were children in these protests. That wasn't the most troubling thing. The most troubling thing was my father saying, what right do these people have to protest? And I didn't know the answer at the time, but I would have told him the 14th Amendment and the First Amendment to the Constitution. Sometime in this period, I learned that 8 Mile Road was really a color line. And I don't need to say any more about that. So after high school, before I finished college, I worked at the boys training school out in Whitmore Lake. And one of my job responsibilities was to take students who had been recommended for release before an administrative law judge and argue their case, why they should be sent back to the community. That really didn't make me think about law school at the time, but while I was in Whitmore Lake, I often visited friends of mine who were going to U of M Law School, and eventually positive jealousy got to me, and I said, if these characters can go to U of M Law School, I certainly can get through that. So I applied to and was accepted to the University of San Diego Law School, and God was with me. He connected me with the smartest people in the school or in the class. I was in a study group with them for at least a year and a half, and I ended up graduating magna cum laude, which was pretty amazing since I was a pretty bad student most of the time. So that allowed me, that God's involvement, which I didn't recognize at all, allowed me to practice in a field that I really liked. And that was private litigation enforcing the federal securities laws, which means I sued companies, major publicly traded companies, for fraud, for lying about their prospects, their financials, whatever. And I had a blast doing that. I did. But it was rough justice. And by that I mean, you know, we always settled these cases. They involved tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, and we always settled them. And it was really impersonal. I bet in 40 years of doing it, I met 6 or 7 of our plaintiffs because they were just another member of the class. So there was no real justice as I'm going to talk about. It was rough. So you know, at the end of the point of time when I'm now retiring, my attitude about justice was naive and impersonal. My thought was, if I support the right political views and the right political candidates, they'll take care of this problem. But about the same time, God began to change my view. I was involved in San Diego in a homeless program, and we had an executive director resign, which was a good thing because he was great at the practicalities, but he wasn't very good at the fellowship, and it was called the Lato Fellowship. And together with some other people, as we transitioned to a new director, we adopted a prayer request program where volunteers would go around to tables and had these forms, and they would ask, you know, do you have prayers? And we would compile those in an email and 9 years later, that email is still going out every Sunday to people and requesting prayers for those who need it. That's justice. I, in 2017, moved from San Diego to Glen Arbor, and in the same year I had heart surgery, and in the same year I resigned from my job, and it must have been that heart surgery. God gave me a new heart. He promised he would change me, and he did. So in Glen Arbor and at the Glen Lake Church, I began to do something that the Holy Spirit encouraged me to do, and that was to stop saying no to people who came up to me and said, "Hey, you're a lawyer. Do you know anything about drunk driving? Do you know anything about divorce? Do you know anything about wills and probate?" And I would have said, "No, I don't. I don't know anybody who does that, and I'm done." But he called me out and said, "You got to stop doing that." So I began to do things like will administration and end of life, getting people's affairs in order at the end of life, and evictions. And I found a lot of joy in that. And it was on behalf of people who were marginalized, who had suffered some injustice. So along comes COVID in 2020. And I've been enjoying a nice life in Glen Arbor and involved with the church up there and having small groups in my home and walking more with the Lord. And a lot of the people in that church in Glen Arbor were wonderful and supported me and brought me in and taught me what it meant to be a disciple. But it was a resort community. And in March of 2020, after the governor closed the schools and people began working remotely, there were people who had homes up there who decided, well, why stay near the focus of the locus of the disease? Let's go up there where there's not many cases reported, and we can begin our summer vacation in April. And at the same time, news reports began circulating about how COVID's impact on poor communities and communities of color was disparate. It was out of balance. It was much greater in those communities than it was in white communities. Now I started shaking. And I go back to you, Bo, and talking about repentance a couple of weeks ago. He started shaking me about this, and I thought, why am I living here? I mean, I had a nice house on a lake, but why are you living here? And within 6 weeks, he gave me the answer to my question and said, I want you to go down to UAD Jesuit and I want you to volunteer there. And I moved. And at the same time, I was introduced through a group in Traverse City to a book called Me and White Supremacy. And I went through this process with friends of mine from up there. There was about 60 of us maybe who were in small groups, and we would get together once a week and go through the exercises in the book, which was to look at things like white privilege and white exceptionalism, a lot of notions that, arguably were pretty unfavorable to black people. So I moved down. I come down to Detroit, I go to school, I meet the director of diversity and diversity, I can't remember the other words, but inclusion. And I become part of campus ministry, and I go on retreats, and I get involved with senior service, and I'm starting to understand what joy is. But there's this. And I say to the director of diversity and inclusion, I've been through this. I could facilitate discussion groups with the faculty on this. And she was very excited about that. She knew the book. She liked the idea. But I began to get a sense that she wasn't really supported in her job. And since then, I've learned a lot more about that and about what happened. But I did this for 3 semesters with 7 or 8 faculty members at a time. And in the first group, one of the senior executives of the school was in the group. And after about 3 weeks, he said, I don't understand why I'm in this group. There's nothing in this for me. And somebody else at the school that I knew really well from a long time ago who worked in development said, why do they have to use the word supremacy? Isn't that what the Ku Klux Klan is? And so I felt this pushback, which I felt through some friends, a really close friend of mine who, when I said, I'm having this issue, I'm talking to people about white privilege, and they're like, what are you talking about? And she said, well, that's because white privilege doesn't exist. So that was shaking for me, because I thought I was in a place where this was a safe conversation, and it clearly was not. So, God being God, he continued to put people in my life. And after I'd been at UAD Jesuit for a couple of years, he introduced me to the Reverend J.B. Fields, who was a theology teacher at the school and also is a youth pastor at Hartford Baptist Church. And he's Black. And we met on a retreat. We met on one of these Kairos retreats and became good friends really quickly, kind of co-mentors of each other. And he shared with me, look, he said, this school is not doing right by the Black students. And he wanted to do a retreat, an African American spirituality retreat. And he got a lot of pushback, not on the African American aspect, but on the aspect of how he wanted to do it and who he wanted to include. And anyway, he's still there, and I give him a lot of credit because he has created an African American spirituality class that is amazing. And he's invited me into it. I can go there anytime I want and just listen and hear. And his class involves all sorts of cultural issues. And anyway, it's been great to know him. And it is great to know him. He comes to the Thursday night Bible study. He comes to the Brotherhood breakfast every month. And he has brought many of his students to the Brotherhood breakfast. So he's a blessing, a complete and total blessing in my life. The other person I got to know in this period of time is my current business partner. And what I learned from her was about the real difficulty a single mother has in our society. My partner started her own business. She had, at the time that I met her, a son in eighth grade. To say she has done a phenomenal job of selling her short. In about a month, she's going to be driving this young man up to Michigan Tech, where he's going to go to school for 4 years. And she has spent the last 16 years by herself with this, raising this boy. It's just amazing to me. Not amazing. That's not the right word. But my impression of the legal system is men win. Men don't have to take care of their children. Men don't have to pay fair child support. Again, these are all my notions, and if there's a divorced dad out there, I apologize to you for being so judgmental and generalizing, but I learned more about injustice and oppression. And while we're at it, when I was a lawyer, one of the things I learned about was what it meant to be gay. And I had not been a very open-minded person about gays until I had a young man who worked for me who was a Michigan-trained lawyer, U of M lawyer, who whose work was phenomenal, best associate we ever had out there, and his work fell off. This was probably the late, like 89, maybe 90. And my partners and I brought him in and said, "Hey, what's going on? You know, you need to get things together here because you've fallen off." And he said, "I've been meaning to come and talk to you guys. I'm HIV positive," which at the time was a death sentence. And my notions and attitudes completely evaporated and disappeared because that wasn't right. That was unjust. And he was probably gone 2 months later. So I see this issue of justice as relating to a wide range of behaviors, attitudes, notions, and I'm not going to solve it in this talk, but I know that when I ask myself about justice and what I'm going to call biblical justice one time, justice is foundational to our walk with and understanding of God. To grasp justice, we need to consider two Hebrew words. One is mishpat, which is loosely translated as justice. And it's a deeply relational concept involving a couple principles. First, righting wrongs and restoring justice to the oppressed, and the notion of equal worth, that we are all image bearers because we are created in the image of God. That's a concept that I didn't know as image bearing when I was at U of D Jesuit, but I did know that I was called to see God in every person. And once you take that perspective, all these other attitudes go away. The other word is tzedakah, righteousness. And again, this is deeply relational, and it calls us to, again, view people with the God-given dignity they deserve as image bearers and the standard of right relationships, which we should be pursuing with everyone that we know and interact with because they are made in the image of God. And it calls on us to lift up the vulnerable so the vulnerable can flourish. And I think of our vision, which we just saw. So biblically, when I use the word justice, I suspect many of you think of Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. The backstory is simple. Micah in the 8th century confronted a society in Israel that was highly corrupt, oppressed the poor, and engaged in religious hypocrisy. And this is God's response to the Israelites who sarcastically say, "What do you want? 1,000 rivers of olive oil?" No, this is what I want. So I'm going to skip the next slide, by the way. In the New Testament, the gospel is at its core God creating a way to enact justice through compassion and love. Justice visibly displays the love of God, and the concept of justice expands into the works and teachings of Jesus. There's a few characteristics here we find manifested starting in the Old Testament, but continuing on through the New Testament. First of all, we see God's heart for the marginalized in the Old Testament, the quartet of the vulnerable, the orphan, the widow, the poor, and the immigrant. Christ presents this in a new way in the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek, those who hunger for and thirst for righteousness, the peacemakers, and those who are persecuted because of righteousness. Matthew 25, 31 through 43, that whole litany of what we're to do and what we didn't do. But as Jesus replies there, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. The mandate to care for the vulnerable in the New Testament becomes an expression of God's love and the reality of his kingdom on earth. Another characteristic of justice is this idea of restoration over retribution. And in Matthew 5, 23 through 24, Jesus says, as part of the Sermon on the Mount, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar, first go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Finally, the gospel of Christ bridges the gap between justice and mercy. Jesus satisfying the ultimate requirement of justice at the cross to offer unearned mercy and reconciliation to humanity. So one of my favorite stories in the Gospels is the widow at the Nain Gate. This is a story in which you can really see Jesus' humanity. You know, if you look around, that's what Jesus looked like too. He had hands, he had eyes, he had a heart, and he had a voice. And he uses them in this story. Soon after, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her and he said, "Don't cry." Then he went up and touched the bier they were carrying him on, and the bearers stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. So in this story, we see Jesus sees the widow with his eyes, a woman who's lost everything, and in those times, she had few legal, economic, or social rights outside of her husband's or her son's. Losing an only son meant the widow was likely to face total destitution, hunger, and homelessness. Jesus is moved with deep sympathy from his heart. Jesus walked over, told the mother not to cry, and touched his hand to the bier. He commanded the young man with his voice to arise. For me, thinking about justice, this story has 2 points. You have to have compassion in order to do justice. Your heart has to be in it. And the power of Christ's voice. We have a voice as well. And our voice has power. And when we speak, we never know what might occur. But if we see injustice, we're called to speak. Finally, Jesus' death on the cross. Near the cross, near the cross of Jesus stood his mother, his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son," and to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. In this verse, Jesus, ever the compassionate Son, is ensuring his mother is cared for after his death. So, again, the power of Christ's voice and your voice. While Seth was speaking, the vision was put up, and I've asked it to be put up again because this is important when it comes to justice. Our vision is to be a beacon, a community that together walks with people in suffering and joy, values people's unique stories, and pursues the flourishing of the world. We are doing justice here at Genesis. Dan and Sharon, who are not here today because they're traveling back from Missouri, just these last two incidents, the Beirut seminary that began hosting Muslims who had lost their homes, a seminary that Dan and Sharon had some connection with, and Dan came to us and said, we have gone through our home, we have collected up many of the items that we gathered from around the world, and we're going to bring them to the church and sell them and give the money to the seminary. Wow. The Kenya Safe House that some of us got an email about, and within 15 minutes, the money needed was raised and more. The power and credibility of their voices. Jordan, who's given this opportunity to reconcile our feelings through and relationships through art, and the opportunity to value other people's unique stories. Jill, who I don't see, has every week pursues the flourishing of the newly housed every week. Trent and Julia, all your efforts with the Warming Center give our community the opportunity to lift up the vulnerable and see God in all people. And all of you who served at the Warming Center lifted up the vulnerable. Kristen, also not here. What I witnessed about Kristen at the Warming Center is something that I've seen her do many times. She doesn't just make food or serve food. She gets out there and gets to the tables and creates relationships with the marginalized. That is a key in doing justice. Marty, thank you for all you've done to bring loved ones and whoever's with you. I don't know that, but for bringing loved ones to Genesis, for the justice that brings. And my friend Daniel, who I don't see here either, who is caring for his father as part of his growth and Daniel's growth. His father's suffering from dementia and Parkinson's, and Daniel has lifted his father up. So there's the good news. We are doing justice, and we need to keep doing justice. And those of you who may wonder about that or what you might do, come see me. Thank you.